what do you make of all the ridiculousness
We've
about
matched.
you and Brad reuniting on all these carpets all season long?
It's hysterical, but what else are they going to talk about?
There's one moment in Brad Pitt's life that almost nobody saw coming. Not a tabloid headline, not a paparazzi photo, but a quiet conversation recorded for a podcast, where he looked his ex-fiancée in the eyes and said 4 simple words, "And I do love you." She answered without missing a beat, "I love you so much." That exchange happened decades after their engagement had collapsed, decades after the world assumed they were just another Hollywood footnote. And it raises the question that has followed Brad Pitt for 30 years. After 2 marriages, a string of high-profile romances, and a private life that has been picked apart in magazines since he was 25 years old, who actually holds the deepest place in his heart? Today we're tracing the entire story, from the relationships nobody remembers to the ones the whole world still argues about, to find out. Before any of the fame, Brad Pitt was just a kid from the Midwest. Born in Shawnee, Oklahoma, and raised in Springfield, Missouri, he grew up around church, football, and small-town theater, about as far from Hollywood as you could get. When he eventually packed up his car and drove to Los Angeles, he wasn't chasing stardom so much as just trying to survive. He took odd jobs, including one famously awkward stint wearing a giant chicken costume to promote a fast food chain, while he scraped together money for acting classes. But even broke and unknown, people noticed him. His first serious relationship came in 1986, when he started dating British pop singer Sunita, who was already a recognizable name in the UK music scene thanks to her chart hits. They were together for close to 2 years. She would later describe him warmly as sweet, easygoing, and full of youthful charm, the kind of guy who hadn't yet been changed by fame. When she eventually saw him break out on the big screen, she admitted she felt a pang of regret about letting him go. After that came a string of short, mostly forgettable relationships that read more like a list of who's who in late 1980s Hollywood than any kind of grand love story. He briefly dated his cutting-class co-star Jill Scullin. He was linked to voice actress E.G. Daily, who later said she could tell even back then that he had a rare, almost restless drive to succeed. He found himself at the center of one of his first real tabloid storms when he was rumored to have been involved with actress Robin Givens during her contentious split from boxer Mike Tyson, a claim Tyson made in his own memoir, and one Givens has pushed back on. And, in a moment that sounds like it was scripted for a rom-com, he was famously left mid-party by Married, with children's star Christina Applegate at the 1989 MTV Movie Awards, for another man she has still never named publicly. It's worth pausing on just how ordinary Brad Pitt's life looked in those years, because it makes everything that came after feel even stranger. He wasn't networking his way through industry parties or dating other rising stars for visibility. He was bartending, doing odd construction jobs, and going to open auditions like thousands of other 20-somethings who never end up making it. The relationships from that period reflect that they were the kind of relationships any young guy in his mid-20s might have. Messy and short-lived and largely forgotten by everyone except the people involved. The difference is that within a few short years, every single one of those names would get dug back up by the press, reframed and re-examined, as if they'd been clues to something bigger all along. The relationship from that era that actually meant something lasted for years. In late 1989, Brad began dating actress Juliette Lewis, who was 16 at the time, while he was 26. They worked together on more than one film, and their bond outlasted plenty of relationships built on far more stability. Years after they split, Brad told Vanity Fair that he still cared deeply for her, even with real distance between them by then. Juliette, for her part, has been far less nostalgic about it in interviews since, saying more than once that she'd rather be known for her own career than for who she dated in her 20s, which is a fair thing to want, frankly, when you've spent decades being introduced as someone's ex. Then came the film that turned Brad Pitt from promising young actor into an actual phenomenon. His brief, charismatic turn in Thelma and Louise made him a star almost overnight, and from that point on, his love life stopped being gossip column filler and started being front-page news. The first real grand romance of his fame years was with Gwyneth Paltrow. They met on the set of the 1995 thriller Say Seven, played a married couple on screen, and became an actual couple off it almost immediately. Their connection moved fast. At the 1996 Golden Globes, accepting an award for 12 Monkeys, Brad stood on stage and called Gwyneth his angel, and, in his own words, the love of my life. It's one of the only times in his entire public career he has used that exact phrase about anyone. He proposed to her not long after, during a trip to Argentina, and for a while, the two of them were treated as Hollywood's golden couple of the decade, magazine covers, red carpets, the whole picture. Then, in June of 1997, Gwyneth called off the engagement. She has said since that she simply wasn't ready, that she still had a lot of growing up to do in her early 20s, and that the breakup left her genuinely heartbroken even though it was the right call. What's remarkable is what happened after. The two of them didn't disappear from each other's lives. Years later, in a conversation recorded for Gwyneth's own platform, they sat across from each other, laughed about how everything eventually worked out, and told each other plainly that they still loved one another, not romantically, but in a way that clearly never fully went away. In a separate interview, Gwyneth called their whirlwind romance love at first sight, and admitted it took her years to understand why it didn't work out the way either of them expected. If Gwyneth Paltrow represented Brad's first taste of being part of a genuine Hollywood power couple, what came next turned him into one half of arguably the most watched marriage of his generation. Jennifer Aniston was, by the late 1990s, one of the most recognizable faces on television thanks to Friends. She and Brad had actually crossed paths years earlier through their managers, with nothing coming of it. But by 1998, both of them were single again, and when they were introduced a second time, it clicked immediately. Jennifer later described their first date as easy and natural, nothing forced about it. By September of 1999, they made their red carpet debut as a couple at the Emmy Awards, and 2 months later, at a concert in New York, they announced their engagement. Their wedding took place on July 29, 2000, in Malibu, an extravagant ceremony with around 200 guests that became one of the most talked about weddings of the era. For the next several years, Brad and Jen weren't just a celebrity couple. They were kind of cultural shorthand for the perfect Hollywood marriage. Easy chemistry, genuine warmth. A guest appearance Brad made on Friends itself that fans still bring up today. They even built a production company together that would go on to make some genuinely significant films. It's easy to forget, looking back, how thoroughly that marriage was held up as the gold standard at the time. Magazines ran cover stories speculating about when they'd start a family. Their style choices were dissected and copied. Even people who didn't follow celebrity news closely seemed to know who Brad and Jen were as a unit, the same way people knew about other iconic pairings of earlier decades. That kind of scrutiny is hard on any relationship, let alone one carried out almost entirely in public. But cracks were forming underneath all of that, and they became impossible to ignore once Brad started filming Mr. and Mrs. Smith opposite Angelina Jolie. In January 2005, Brad and Jennifer announced their separation after nearly 5 years of marriage. The divorce was finalized later that year, and Jennifer has spoken candidly more than once about how painful that period was for her, describing it at the time as one of the most raw and difficult stretches of her life, made worse by being picked apart in public the entire way through. What's interesting is that the bitterness many people expected never really materialized in public, at least not from either of them directly. In 2007, Brad told a magazine that he and Jennifer still maintained a real friendship, and that they shared too much history to simply erase it. Over the years that followed, the two of them kept crossing paths in ways that made headlines every single time. A handhold backstage at an award show in 2020, a flirty virtual table read for charity that same year, a quiet appearance Brad made at her 50th birthday party in 2019. None of it has ever turned into a public reconciliation, and both of them have built entirely separate lives since. But it's also true that whenever cameras catch them in the same room, even decades later, people still can't look away, which says something about how much that relationship still means to audiences, even if neither Brad nor Jennifer has ever called it the deepest love of his life on the record. While all of that was unfolding in the public eye, something far more consequential was already taking root on the set of Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Angelina Jolie has said that she and Brad didn't fall for each other instantly while filming. It built gradually, through long days of stunt work and the strange intimacy of pretending to be married on screen, until she realized she was genuinely looking forward to coming to work simply because he'd be there. By the summer of 2005, photos of Brad with Angelina and her children in Kenya set off a media frenzy. By 2006, she was pregnant with their daughter, Shiloh, and not long after, Brad formally adopted Angelina's 2 older children. Over the next few years, their family kept growing. A son in 2007, twins in 2008, until Brad, who had once seemed hesitant about fatherhood altogether, was raising 6 kids as the patriarch of one of the most photographed families on the planet. The press nicknamed them Brangelina, and for a stretch of years, they weren't just actors. They were treated almost like a global institution, doing humanitarian work, traveling internationally, dominating headlines no matter what they did. In 2014, after 9 years together, Brad and Angelina married privately at their French estate, Chateau Miraval, in a ceremony where their children played a central role. Angelina's dress was even embroidered with the kids' own drawings. For a moment, it looked like the chapter was closing on a happy ending. It didn't. In September 2016, Angelina filed for divorce, citing the health of the family, and what followed became one of the longest and most bitter celebrity divorces in recent memory. There were investigations into an alleged incident on a private plane. Both the FBI and Child Protective Services ultimately closed their inquiries without filing charges, and a custody and financial battle, much of it centered on their jointly owned French vineyard, that dragged on for years. The divorce wasn't fully finalized until December of 2024, nearly 8 years after it began, and the fallout has continued to surface even recently. Earlier this year, one of their adult sons filed legal paperwork to drop the Pitt name entirely, a quiet but telling sign of just how much distance has grown between Brad and parts of that family since. For Brad, the years with Angelina represented both the deepest commitment of his adult life and the most painful unraveling of it. It's hard to overstate how much that relationship reshaped him publicly. He's spoken since about going through real struggles with alcohol in the aftermath, and about doing serious work in therapy to understand his own patterns, his own choices, and how they'd affected the people closest to him. He's talked about that period as a genuine turning point, the moment he had to stop running from accountability and actually sit with the parts of himself he didn't like. It's a strange thing to watch a public figure go through that kind of reckoning in real time, mostly through court filings and the occasional careful interview, rather than the splashy confessionals celebrities sometimes lean on. But by most accounts, the work was real, and it changed how he approached everything that came after, including how he chose to date. After the divorce became public, Brad mostly stepped back from dating in any visible way for a while, focusing on his kids and his work. But every time he was seen with someone new, the speculation started right back up. In 2018, he was linked to MIT professor and architect Neri Oxman, someone entirely outside his usual Hollywood orbit. She later denied they were romantically involved, though she spoke warmly of him as a friend. In 2020, his name was tied briefly to German model Nicole Paczorowski, a connection that fizzled out within months. In 2022, he was seen spending time with model Emily Ratajkowski not long after her own separation, something friends described as casual and low-key rather than serious. None of these turned into anything lasting, and in hindsight, they read less like grand romances and more like a man figuring out, slowly and somewhat privately, what he actually wanted next. What he wanted, it turns out, was something a lot quieter than anything he'd had before. Ines de Ramon, a jewelry designer who had recently separated from actor Paul Wesley, entered Brad's life in late 2022. Their early relationship stayed almost entirely out of the spotlight, with the two of them first spotted together at a concert that November. Over the following 2 years, things grew steadily more serious without ever turning into a tabloid spectacle, which, given Brad's history, is itself remarkable. They made their first real red carpet appearance together at the Venice Film Festival in September 2024. Since then, sources close to the couple have described them as fully living together, genuinely happy, and deliberately avoiding the kind of public displays that defined his earlier relationships. In a rare comment to GQ, Brad simply said that relationships evolve, and that life moves forward, Not exactly a dramatic declaration, but maybe a telling one from a man who spent most of his adult life being asked to perform his private life for the public. As of this year, the two have been spotted together at major public events, including a high-profile outing at the French Open, holding hands in the stands, clearly comfortable being seen together at last. Insiders say marriage isn't really on the table for either of them right now. Both have already been through very public divorces, but that they're as settled and content as Brad has reportedly been in years. So who is it then? If you go strictly by what's actually on the record, Brad Pitt has only ever used the exact phrase "the love of my life" publicly about one person, Gwyneth Paltrow, standing on a stage in 1996, decades before any of his marriages even happened. And remarkably, that same warmth surfaced again, unprompted, years later, when the two of them sat down together as friends and told each other, plainly, that the love never really disappeared. But love isn't only measured in the words someone says into a microphone once. It's also measured in who you build a family with, who you fight to hold onto even when it nearly breaks you, and who you choose to come home to once the noise finally quiets down. By that measure, you could make just as strong a case for Angelina Jolie, the mother of 6 of his children, or for Ines de Ramon, the woman he's reportedly more at peace with than he's been in years. Maybe the honest answer is that there isn't one tidy answer at all, that a person can love different people in genuinely different ways across a lifetime, and that trying to crown just one of them as the one says more about our appetite for a clean, simple story than it does about how real relationships actually work. What do you think? Was it Gwyneth, Jennifer, Angelina, or someone the public has barely paid attention to? Drop your take in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Hollywood's most watched love lives, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more stories like this one.